Good morning, everyone. Okay, we'll get started with the event. I'm Oliver Kaplan. I'm an assistant professor here and the associate director of the Human Trafficking Center, and I want to welcome you to the Korbel School and the University of Denver. Today we're here for a very important signing of a proclamation about human trafficking awareness. And for the signing, I'd like to recognize Dr. Pardis Mahdavi, who's with us, Dr. Claude Destray, who's the director of the Human Trafficking Center, and Executive Director Stephanie O'Malley from the Denver Mayor's Office. Welcome. We also have in attendance Representative Paul Lundeen, who is co-sponsoring some safe harbor laws, bills, and Kate Bowman from the Colorado Human Trafficking Council, and also Brendan Davidson from the Colorado Human Trafficking Council from the Colorado Department of Safety. Unfortunately, Chancellor Chop, the Chancellor of the University of Denver, could not attend today, nor could State Senator John Kefalas, who's worked with the HTC outreach team to pass safe harbor legislation. I'd like to give just a brief background of the Human Trafficking Center. The Human Trafficking Center was founded in 2002 by Professor Claude Destray to promote education about the issue of human trafficking and to encourage rigorous academic research. It is the only, it's a unique MA program and really the only MA program of its kind in the country, focusing on human trafficking. And our flagship research project over the past several years has been to produce a human trafficking index, which collects data at the country level worldwide on human trafficking trends and trends in policies to counter human trafficking. I'll just say a few more remarks about the center. The center is really a magnet for students who come from all over the country and even all over the world to come to DU to study human trafficking. And these students are deeply involved in all activities of the center, from education to research to outreach and as well as policy advocacy activities. Furthermore, these students have graduated, thankfully, wonderfully, and then gone on to hold key positions in the human trafficking field in both nonprofit organizations and governmental organizations around the world. And one of our key missions at the Human Trafficking Center is to promote awareness of the problem of human trafficking on campus, among the broader Colorado community, and globally. But this is not always an easy task, in some cases, to raise awareness beyond the Human Trafficking Center, where we have such dedicated students. And so that's why this proclamation, I believe, is so significant, is that it will begin to help continually raise awareness around the University of Denver community. So I can't think of a better person as a keynote speaker for our event today to help us commemorate the proclamation than our acting dean, Dr. Pardis Mahdavi. I'll just give a brief bio to Dr. Mahdavi, and then I'll introduction to her, and I'll turn it over to her for her remarks. Dr. Mahdavi received her PhD in Socio-Medical Sciences and Anthropology, and also has an MPhil in Anthropology and a Master's in International Affairs from Columbia University, as well as a bachelor's from Occidental College. And her research interests greatly intersect and overlap with the Human Trafficking Center. Her research includes topics such as gendered labor, human trafficking, migration, and human rights. She's also the author of, if I get it correctly, at least 2 books on themes related to human trafficking, and possibly more.
4, yeah.
4 books, but 4 books total, but 2 that are closer related to human
5
trafficking.
books total, 4 on human trafficking.
Okay, so I have an old bio. So the 2 books that stood out to me were Gridlock, Labor Migration and Human Trafficking in Dubai from Stanford University Press, and then From Trafficking to Terror, Constructing a Global Social Problem from Routledge Press. Please join me in welcoming Dean Mahdavi.
Thanks so much, Ali. Well, welcome to the Human Trafficking Center. Welcome to Korbel. Welcome to DU. It's great to see some folks here for, I think, what is an incredibly significant moment for HTC and for Korbel. You don't often see institutes of higher education moving forward in an area, taking a stance on policy issues, coming out of the ivory tower, building these gaps between higher education and policy. So it's really, really nice to see that. I just want to talk really briefly about why this issue is so important and why having a proclamation and why having a center dedicated to deconstructing what we understand as human trafficking is so significant today in 2018. When we think about human trafficking, when we say the phrase human trafficking, I think it evokes a lot of images, stereotypes, or what we academics like to call discursive tropes. And the problem is that there's a lot of misinformation about human trafficking. And that misinformation has actually led to less robust policies. And in fact has led to policies that do more harm than good, right? And I'll talk about some examples of that. But the other thing is that the framework of human trafficking, which is a very powerful framework, a very powerful tool for advancing human rights, has actually been misused to abuse human rights. And that's why I think it's so important for us to take a moment to deconstruct what we understand as human trafficking in order to have our frameworks inform more robust policies, right? So the way I like to think about it is that the human trafficking framework has been disproportionately raced, classed, and gendered, right? So we have all sorts of myths about human trafficking that perpetuate inequalities in terms of race, class, and gender. So what do I mean by that? Let's start with an easy one, gender. The way I used to explain human trafficking to my students when I was teaching, I really miss teaching, but when I was teaching at Pomona College is, I would tell the students to imagine a rubber band, okay? Somehow the human trafficking framework is like a rubber band in that it stretches wide enough to encapsulate every woman in the sex industry, whether or not they were actually trafficked, but then it shrinks to exclude people outside the sex industry, particularly men, particularly women identifying folks who are in domestic work, people who are in agricultural work, people who are in basically labor areas where trafficking takes place. Now, I think when I first started to do my research on human trafficking, certainly when Claude was first doing his research, by the way, you have a fantastic resource here in that I think Claude was one of the first people who was working on trafficking before it became sexy, right? And we all know when it became sexy, right? It was right around Bill Clinton and then George W. Bush, and we can talk about that as well. But and why that is. But when I first started working on human trafficking, I had been doing field work in Dubai. And one of the things that I noticed is I had actually been following sex workers from Tehran to Dubai. And these were women who would go to Dubai for 3 or 4 months out of the year, make a huge sum of money, and come back and support their families. These are not women who I would consider trafficked, right? But when I was following them to Dubai, I was noticing that I would see thousands of men, typically South Asian men, but men from around the world, who were actually literally in chains, right? They were in chains, building the skyscrapers and the hotels that so many of you like to stay in 130-degree heat, right? I mean, you guys, people like to complain, oh, it's so hot, it's like 85, 9, 130-degree heat. These men would work in 36-hour shifts in actual chains. And I remember I came back. This is when the conversations were early. This is 2007, 2008. And I came back and I said, yeah, I'm looking at human trafficking in the Gulf. And people would say, oh, I know, it's so terrible, those poor women, they're trafficked. And you're studying the Iranian women, right? And I'm like, yeah, actually, the women aren't really trafficked, it's the men. And people would laugh. They would say, come on, Pardis, men can't be trafficked, right? They would actually laugh. And so when I was working with men that had actually experienced forced fraud or coercion, which is what we define as human trafficking, we couldn't get services for them because they were men, right? They were outside of what was conceived of as the sort of popular human trafficking framework. To my mind, this really has come about because the human trafficking framework, right? And it's no accident that a lot of the conversation around trafficking came up right around 2001, okay? So the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, was signed by Bill Clinton, but actually brought into effect by George W. Bush, right, 2001. And so I was reflecting in 2011 on the 10-year anniversary of 9/11, I was there, which was the 10-year anniversary of the War on Terror. But it was also the 10-year anniversary of the War on Trafficking. And the way I understood it was that, look, the War on Trafficking is the hyper-feminized antidote to the hyper-masculinized War on Terror, right? And that's why you get this sort of hyper-feminization and the hyper-focus on sex. But that doesn't serve anybody, right? I mean, the sex issue is, of course, incredibly important, but so is labor trafficking, right? And so are trafficking abuses that are encouraged against men, against non-gender identifying folks. And the framework at the time wouldn't really allow for that. It was so focused, and you look at the TVPRA, right, the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act that was signed into effect by George W. Bush, and you see that there is a specific breakout definition for severe forms of trafficking, and that is sex trafficking, right? So it basically, the protections of the T visa, right, which we've changed a lot of that, but the protections of the T visa were only afforded to people who fit the bill of severe forms of human trafficking. Now you have to ask yourselves about the T visa, the trafficking visa, right? You have to ask yourselves, why is it that we promised 5,000 T visas per year back in 2002? It's 2018, and we haven't given out a total of 5,000 yet. You have to ask yourself why, right? And I believe that a lot of it has to do with the gendering and the sexualization of the discourse. What do I mean by that the discourse is race or racialization of the discourse? When I was first doing this work, there was this sense that trafficking was something that mostly happened over there, right? It didn't really happen here. The United States itself wasn't ranked in the Trafficking in Persons report, right? The US just didn't feel the need to rank itself. Now they do, but in the first 10 years of the TIP, the US did not rank itself. Films came out. How many of you have seen Taken? Right, okay. So, no spoiler, right? Spoiler alert for those of you who haven't seen it. The conclusion is that it is young white women who are trafficked by brown men with Middle Eastern accents who are dealing in the flesh of young white girls. That's the trope, right? And when you think about some of Nicholas Kristof's earliest articles, when you think about the cover of the New York Times Magazine, that iconic cover of that young, probably 14-year-old white upper middle class girl sitting on a bed and says, this is the trafficking victim. I remember thinking no, it's not, right? Like an upper class young woman, when you see Taken, that's not the bulk of who's trafficked. It's usually people who are forced to choose from amongst a series of very limited options, right? And I remember going to these luncheons with these very upper class, wealthy white women, and they were like, I got into trafficking because it could be my daughter. And I'm like, no, it couldn't. Not really, right? Who are the people who are trafficked? For those of us who've actually worked with survivors, for those of us who've actually dedicated our lives to interviewing, to qualitative, to actual in-depth, robust data collection on these topics, we know that when we think about class and race, it's typically women and men who are marginalized, who are persons of color, and who are in lower classes, right? These are people who are the most vulnerable, who are the most marginalized. And so you see that there's both a racialization in that the trafficker, right, is sort of narrated as a brown or black man, often with Middle Eastern accents through film. But even when you look at the Trafficking in Persons report, the TIP report, when you look at the section, for instance, on Iran, right, and this is an area that I've looked at very closely. The language about the trafficking issue in Iran is, the voracious appetites of Iranian men. And you're like, what? And when you look at then the language around, Scandinavia or other countries, it's like, well, no, that's not really an issue. And so what happens is that the Trafficking in Persons report begins to undermine its own strength, right? Because the countries that are ranked in tier 3, which is the lowest ranking, include countries like Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea. Are you noticing a pattern? Right, they're the countries that the US ranks as foe, and the countries that are in the tier 1 ranking are the countries that the US ranks as friend. And so it undermines its own strength by doing that. So I just briefly want to speak to some examples of policies that have been enacted to respond to human trafficking that tend to make things worse rather than better. The Trafficking in Persons report ranked the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, which is has been my field site for over a decade, in the tier 2 watch list, which is not where you want to be if you're a major trading partner of the United States. The UAE was told that if they wanted to get off the watch list, that they had to double their prosecutions and they had to double their police. Now, what did that mean? The UAE actually imports most of its police force because citizens are paid to be citizens, and so they don't really need to work more often than not. So they import their police force. The police force are imported, they're not trained, right? They're typically not trained on these issues. When I was interviewing survivors during my time in the United Arab Emirates, over 10 years of field work, the women who did report rape or abuse who were in the sex industry, or even women who were domestic workers who were not in the sex industry who reported sexual violations, of those women, 70% of them reported sexual violation at the hands of the police in the UAE. So when the Trafficking in Persons report makes a recommendation that the police be doubled, you're doubling your problem, right? So again, because we don't have this sense, because we don't recognize that the trafficking issue in the UAE is much larger than the sex industry, it's not just women, it's men and women. When I said to them, maybe double your labor inspectors if you want to deal with trafficking, instead they doubled their cops, right? So this is one example. Another example is in 2006, the Philippine government enacted the Philippine Household Service Reform Package. This was a package that the Philippines government adopted, again, in order to get off the Tier 2 watch list. And it basically said that, okay, you know, if you want to recruit Filipino women, you have to guarantee a certain number of hours. You have to, all Filipino women have to go through an added layer of bureaucracy that can take up to 18 months. When I interviewed Filipino women about their experience after the Philippine Household Service Reform Package was passed, the way that they referred to it was that the door was closed, but the window was open. So the Philippine government continues to be beholden to structural adjustment policies, typically set by the IMF and World Bank in Washington, D.C., wherein their debt repayment is tethered to their remittances, right? So the Philippine government is more invested in sending their women in particular abroad, because women are known to send home more remittances, than they are vested in actually having jobs for them at home. So what does that mean? If you want to feed your children, you're going to have to go abroad. Well, what does it mean to increase the bureaucracy for women to go abroad? It means more women were being smuggled, more women were having themselves smuggled, so more women were actually vulnerable to abuse as a result of this policy. Today, there's conversations about using human trafficking as a framework to tighten borders, right? You all have heard that, tighten your borders. Trafficking, unfortunately, has been used and misused because we don't have a robust understanding of what it is and who it's designed to protect. It's been used to basically as an excuse to not let in people who might be suspect, right? And so there again, you have an issue of when you tighten your borders, you increase smuggling, and that is data that we have from around the world. So with the new policies that are currently being proposed, it's more likely that more smuggling will be taking place. So what we see here then is that the picture is incomplete, right? That the picture is filled with policies that are based on knee-jerk responses rather than well thought out, robust data, right? So I think that when we do, when we have centers like the Human Trafficking Center that are dedicated to actual rigorous inquiry of what the problem is, that's the most important step that we can take towards crafting more robust policies. So I think I just want to end by reminding folks that the fight against trafficking is actually a fight for human rights, and we need to not forget that if we want to create policies that can actually create lasting change. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Proclamation here for you all to sign.
Great.
Okay. I'll borrow your. It's a work.
He gave this to me. It's an HTC pen.
Classic, I would give the mayor's office a pen that didn't work. And our Chancellor, Rebecca Chop, is going to be signing this a little bit later in the day. So
Should be saying it tomorrow
that's
morning.
it.
Great.
So this was a treat for me, because I could just sit here and be, well, I was going to say a pretty face, but that was not true. And not have to say anything. And I know I'm not supposed to say anything, but I have to say, but I do have to say something, which is to say, I always knew that I had an ally when Pardis joined us as first our senior associate dean, which sad, our sad dean, the sad person, and now our acting dean, this is yet another reminder that we really have to get you more involved in the Human Trafficking Center. I mean, your voice is really important, and it was a real treat for me to be able to listen to what you had had to say. So I'm going to harass you and suggest that you have to do more of this. And in fact, I now know I'm planning to take a sabbatical. I haven't told you this yet. And so I now know who's going to take the course, right?
I would love to.
Okay, so she's going to take the course while I'm on sabbatical. So that would be really wonderful. So thank you. And I want to thank you very much for coming from the mayor's office. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
Sure, absolutely. And of course, the mayor would be here if he could, but this is an important issue, of course, in the mayor's administration, human rights, and the things that we do in his administration, as you know, aligned with his philosophy and his heart and his compassion, certainly speak to human rights for all and the dignity for all individuals. I actually serve as executive director for our Department of Safety in the City and County of Denver, and we intersect with regards to this issue from a policing standpoint and see it on the other side when, you know, folks are taken advantage of relative to those considerations. So we're here to be supportive and continue to let us know how we can engage with you all and support your work here at the university.
Thank you. Appreciate you coming down.
Sure.
Very much.
Yeah.